It's not like I ever notice when anyone's calling me anyways. Alright, if you want to read along today, we're going to begin in Psalms 137. One of those that is surprisingly hard not to sing along with, as it's been made the refrain of a couple different hymns. Psalms 137. Yeah, right. Beside the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept, as we thought of Jerusalem. We put away our harps, hanging them on the branches of poplar trees. For our captors demanded a song from us, our tormentors insisted on a joyful hymn. Sing us one of the songs of Jerusalem. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land? Lord, I thank you for this day, for this opportunity to come before them and preach in your name and your holy message. I pray you would bless this service and each and every one of us. In your name, amen. So, an interesting question this day, posed by an interesting psalm. It's interesting to me because I usually think of the book of Psalms as being primarily the work of King David, who, between him and his chief musician, do seem to have written the lion's share of them. This, I am fairly confident in saying, is not one of his, since Babylon won't exist until a couple centuries after he dies. Well, it may have existed, but it will not be a preeminent power for a very long time. It will be ages before Nebuchadnezzar rises and takes the throne. That's the difficult thing to remember when reading through the Old Testament, that a vast majority of these guys are not contemporaries with each other. It's sometimes hard when you look back at history from our vantage point and to remember things like Hannibal and Julius Caesar may both be from ancient Rome, but they lived almost 100 years apart from another. The one we really like mentioning is Cleopatra is supposedly closer to us than she was to the people who built the pyramids. So it's just interesting to keep these things in perspective. But this is an important question this morning posed by Psalms. How to sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land. Insert Californian joke here. But the fact of the matter is that each of us live our lives in enemy territory, as it were. Earth is a fallen kingdom. We live in a post-sin world. And we live in nations and structures and organizations ran by fallen, sinful, occasionally demon-filled human beings. I don't think there's any institution made by man that can survive terribly long before becoming corrupt. I think we are incredibly lucky and blessed to live in a predominantly Christian nation founded on Christian ideals, and generally to this day, for the most part, still concerned with doing what we consider to be right from a biblical point of view. Even people who would deny that, more often than not, if you pay attention to what they actually say, they still argue with a morality that is drawn more from the Bible than it is any other work. But the fact remains that America is still a contemporary carnal kingdom, and thus under the authority, to some extent at least, of the great enemy, the devil. The temptation of Christ from the New Testament has Satan take Jesus up on a hill and offer him the kingdoms of the world. If I understand the word temptation correctly, that only works if Satan has some authority over those kingdoms. Last time I checked, if Jesus has a brand new SUV and Satan offers him that SUV, that's not a temptation because he already has the thing. So to some extent, at least, I think it's biblically sound to say that I'm just straight up stealing someone else's sermon at this point, that once you leave those doors, you are entering enemy territory. That we get our nice little kingdoms of our own personal homes and church buildings. But outside of that, for the most part, you kind of live in a pagan land. as Psalm says. And the question driving throughout a lot of the Old Testament is how that affects, well, and the New Testament as well, is how you should relate with that. How to strike that balance between living in this world but not being a part of it. Because that's a question Israel has to deal with every other generation. From the slavery in Egypt, to the Philistines taking them over every other week, to the much famed and feared Babylonian captivity, on down through the years to Alexander the Great conquering the area, to Rome having them under their heel, and then the narrative shifts to the Christian church, which, as we all know, was well respected and liked by Nero and the other Roman emperors, are kind of the opposite of that. So Christians, just as much as the Israelites from the Old Testament, constantly have to struggle and deal with the question of how to live a Christian lifestyle in countries and places that are not really openly receptive to that. And of course, it's obviously incredibly difficult if you belong to, say, the Chinese church, which at least in prior decades literally had to do silent worship services. Which, hey, I might prefer, since I can't carry a tune to save my life. So it might be easier if you have to just mime along to the words so you don't alert any guards to what you're doing. But in a strange way, I occasionally find myself envious of people who live in countries where Christianity is actively persecuted. Or even missionaries reaching groups and tribes and remote communities that have never heard the word before. Because the lines are so much clearer drawn. If the government's going to kill you for singing a hymn, I imagine you have a really clear idea of what counts as a hymn. I don't think it's much of a question in those countries what worship really is. Take that versus America, where churches split over debates on what counts as worship music and what doesn't. And so many songs are written to be equally, specifically written to confuse people as to whether or not they're talking about Jesus or their girlfriend. Which on one level I admire, because really, that means you can sneak Christian music into mainstream culture, which is always cool. But on the other hand, kind of feel like it should be a little clearer who you're singing to. Not saying it's wrong, not saying it's right, just observing. And certainly, when preaching to someone who has never heard the gospel before, can you imagine how cool it would be to be the first person telling the greatest story ever told? Take that versus America, where you have to compete with Charlie Brown's Christmas special. Like, everyone knows that story already. Everyone already has the basics. So it can be hard, incredibly hard, to convince them that no, you're not saved just because you live in America. That's not the same thing. There's a couple extra steps to it. So what are you to do when faced with the daunting challenge of being a stranger in a strange land, of being born, living, and dying in foreign enemy territory? Luckily, again, since the Israelites were constantly dealing with that, there are more than a few examples throughout the Bible of how to deal with that. And even into the New Testament, half of Paul's letters can really be boiled down to how in the world you practice a Christian lifestyle when you're likely to get fed to a lion because of it. It's a little more difficult than preparing to argue with that atheist at work. But today, in particular, I have zeroed in on Daniel, just because I think his is a really cool story that I don't talk about enough. Daniel was one of the young men led into captivity in Babylon when he was quite young. I don't have the timeline quite straight in my mind, but I believe he did leave to see the captivity reversed and a lot of Israel head back home. But at that point, he was far too old of a man to make the journey himself. Again, I don't know if that's quite true, but the point is he is one of the predominant prophets from the Old Testament. He's not generally counted as a major prophet because his book is a tenth the size of the other major prophets. But if you actually ask someone to name prophets from the Old Testament, you'll probably get that dude who got ate by a whale and that dude who got ate by lions. So Daniel is like half of the most famous prophets from the Old Testament. And a shining example of how to live a faithful, God-fearing lifestyle in Babylon, which is just about the most unfriendly towards Christian place you can get, the possible exception of San Francisco. So just to let the narrative speak for itself, to flip over to Daniel, chapter 1, to go down to verse, let's see, I believe verse 3. Then the king ordered his chief of staff to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. Then the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. That'll be important later. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So right off the bat here, Daniel is in a very unenviable position of both being about as high a social class as you can get, and also about as low a social class as you can get. On the one hand, his inclusion here means that he was part of either the royal family, or at least a nobility family. He comes from a relatively prestigious background. He's young, he's good looking, he has a very good education, he is about as top of the line in Israel as you can get. However, Israel is currently a conquered kingdom that has been dragged off to a foreign land. So it's a bit like saying, I am a well-educated nobleman of prestigious birth during the French Revolution. I mean, it's cool that you've got a qualified backstory, but this isn't necessarily the best time to be a notable figure in society. But things, well, at least he's not getting his head chopped off. He's been dragged away to a foreign land, and he is being groomed to be a member of a pagan king's personal court. Verse 8, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. And that's interesting. We'll circle back to that in a second. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded. So it's interesting that Daniel is making a fuss about this in the first place, right? Because the only description we get for the food given him is that it's food and wine from the king's personal storehouse. And as we read through the chapter, Daniel's response amounts to, well, fine. You give me and my Israelite buddies nothing but water and vegetables, and we'll see if we get any healthier or less healthier than the people eating the food from the king's royal storehouse. Now, of course, the Mosaic Law is very finicky. Did I say claw? The Mosaic Law, which is a different thing, is very finicky about what foods you can and cannot eat, but it's not a vegetarian diet. Daniel's response here is not falling back on old traditional Jewish law. If I am racking my brains correctly, not even the Levites are asked to eschew meat. The simple fact is, again, in a fallen world, if we may or may not have been vegetarians in the Garden of Eden, that's nice, but we are not now. There is ingredients and foodstuffs in meat and animal products that, sorry vegans, are kind of required to live a healthy life. And that is outlined in the Mosaic Law. Now granted, this story is not covering every base. It is possible that the king of Babylon literally only ate bacon. I mean, if I was king, I'd be awfully tempted. So it's possible that this is only unclean meat being offered to Daniel here, so he has no choice to go the vegetarian route. But I doubt that. Babylon is the original Rome, or in a more modern sense, this is very much the equivalent of New York, or Paris, or London. This is a powerful city. This is like smack dab in the middle of important trade routes. There are people as far flung as the Iberian Peninsula and China even that have crossed through here and traded goods. There is no way that he can't get, like, beef. So this is not born out of any real dietary concerns, but is simply Daniel making a stand for his faith, for his way of life. He is not going to eat the food and wine provided by the king of Babylon, presumably because it was provided by the king of Babylon. He has taken a moral stance against the free food being offered him. And it works. And if you pay attention, you already know why it worked. Because to go back to verse 9, where'd it go? Now God has given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. Simple fact of the matter, he's a dirty little cheater and he has God on his side. Because if this is left to the realistic chance of this working, the guy's not going to have any special love for this random Israelite who's been dragged into captivity and will just tell him flatly no. But God is at work here and gives him special favor with the chief of staff. Realistically, nothing but water and broccoli is not a good diet for you. But as we go on to read in this chapter, Daniel and his friends get healthier, as opposed to the people with the more well-rounded diet provided by the king of Babylon. Because God's at work here. And believe it or not, God can sustain you on just broccoli. That really is a miracle. Do they have broccoli? Is that North American still?
It's European, but it's cold climate.
Okay, so they didn't have broccoli. Middle East is many things, but a cold climate is not one of them. And of course, obviously, well, I'll just go ahead and cheat and read more of the chapter, because I believe we skip all the way down to verse 17. God gave these 4 young men, Daniel plus his 3 buddies, the guys who got chucked in the furnace, that I'm not going to try to pronounce. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel and his friends, so they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained in the royal service until the 1st year of the reign of King Cyrus. So, a couple incredible things in my mind. First, God's favor continues. He gives Daniel and his friends unusual, supernatural understanding and wisdom, and it gets them high positions of authority, despite being literal captives. Second, Daniel and his friends are working as fortune tellers here. This is a pagan king's court. This is the closest we have in modern day would be Haiti. And even that is nothing compared to this pantheistic, polytheistic, witch-filled. This is the equivalent of you getting kidnapped and forced to work with the Wiccans. But God gives you the ability to interpret dreams, so you become better at magic tricks and fortune telling than actual people who practice the Wiccan religion. This is ridiculous in my mind. This is God putting his servants, his young men, his preachers, for all intents and purposes, up against soul. And God winning. Because of course he does. He's God. But it's still fascinating to me that someone with as strict a lifestyle as Daniel, a teetotaler that wants nothing to do with wine, has been put smack dab in the middle of a pagan court and asked to take part in it. And not only that, he's really good at it. Like, he has not only been taken away captive and made to work for the heathens, but because his God is so mighty, he is in good standing in a heathen land. To the point where, as the Bible describes, he will continue to be a right-hand man and top advisor for the Persians, the people who come in and carry away to captivity the Babylonians. This is the equivalent of that noble from the French Revolution. France gets conquered by Spain, which then gets conquered by England, and he's still a #1 advisor and right-hand man to the English king, like decades later through a second regime change. That's incredible. And all from a guy who's so uptight he won't engage in the food and drink of the first foreign land that captured him and his people. That really is the secret to the successful Christian life in this hostile pagan environment that you will always find yourself in one way or another. Trusting and believing in God, because he really is bigger. No matter how ridiculous the odds, no matter how unlikely and how outnumbered you are, if you have him on your side, there's really not a lot to worry about. Not from a Babylonian king, not from angry rival fortune tellers, not from lions, not from the Persians. There's nothing in this world that can stand up to him and stand a chance of winning. Just a purely optimistic sermon for once. Yeah, that's it. No negative for once. It's just straight out the door, straight optimism. So keeping in mind what a powerful and mighty God we serve, do we have anything else we need to pray about or ask before we dismiss? All right then, if Jesse would pray us out of here and bless the food.
Dear Heavenly Father, I pray you keep your hand upon all of us as we go home and go about our day. I pray you bless this food. Amen.
All right, hate to preach and run.